Rufus Calder slammed his fist on the table so hard the inkwell jumped and splattered black across the county surveyor's map. "You have nothing," he said, pointing one thick finger directly at Clara's face. "You are nobody, a drifter, a woman with no name worth defending in this county." He leaned in close enough that she could smell the tobacco and arrogance on his breath. "Walk away before I make sure every door in Kansas closes behind you." Clara didn't move. She didn't blink. And in that moment, standing in a cramped room above the Dry Creek post office, holding a document that could either save a family or destroy what little she had left of herself, she made a choice that would change everything. If you've ever been told you don't matter, that your past makes you worthless, that you should just disappear quietly, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. We release stories every week that go places you don't expect. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Clara did in that room, you need to know what it cost her to walk into it. The morning Clara Vance arrived in Dry Creek, Kansas, the sky was the color of an old bruise, that particular purple-gray that the plains get in late October when the cold is still deciding how serious it wants to be. Stepped off the eastbound stage with one carpetbag and the kind of posture that people read two completely different ways, depending on who they were. The generous ones called it dignity. The suspicious ones called it secrecy. She was 30 years old. She looked like a woman who had been 30 for longer than the calendar suggested. The driver handed down her bag without looking at her, which was fine. Clara had long since stopped needing to be looked at to know she existed. She picked up the bag, shifted it to her left hand. The right one had a small scar across the palm she'd stopped explaining, and turned to face whatever Dry Creek intended to offer her. What it offered first was a gust of wind that nearly took her hat. She caught it with one hand, pressed it down, kept walking. The downtown itself was the kind of place that had ambitions once, and then quietly gave them up. There was a post office, a dry goods store, a livery, a small school with a cracked window on the south side, and 3 churches competing for a congregation that probably couldn't fill one. The main street was packed dirt, frozen at the edges and soft in the middle from the afternoon melt, which meant every step required a small calculation about where to put your foot. Clara made those calculations without thinking about them. She had been making small calculations her whole life. She had a letter in her coat pocket, an advertisement clipped from a Denver paper, the edges worn soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. Housekeeper needed. Briar Hollow Farm, Dry Creek, Kansas. $8 monthly. Inquire Silas Mercer. She had copied the address of the farm from a postal worker in Dodge City who'd given her directions the way people give directions in Kansas, entirely in landmarks that no longer existed. Turn left where the old Carver barn used to be. She'd figured it out anyway. She always figured things out. That was never the problem. A woman sweeping the front step of the dry goods store watched her pass with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something already. Clara didn't stop. She didn't introduce herself. She had learned a long time ago that first impressions in small towns are made in seconds and last for years, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is let people form their opinions before you give them any facts to either confirm or complicate. Briar Hollow Farm was 2 miles northeast of town, along a road that turned into a path and then into a suggestion. By the time Clara came over the low rise and saw the farmhouse below, her feet were cold inside her boots, and her right shoulder ached from the bag. The farmhouse was not what the advertisement had made her imagine. It was larger than she'd expected, but harder-looking white paint gone gray. A porch with one rail missing, a kitchen garden that had clearly not been tended since summer. 3 fence posts on the east side leaned at angles that suggested they'd been meaning to fall for some time and had simply not yet committed. She stopped on the rise and looked at it for a moment. There was smoke coming from the chimney. The barn doors were shut tight against the cold. Somewhere inside, she could hear very faintly a child crying. Not the crying of a child who is hurt, the other kind. The kind that goes on too long and has stopped expecting anyone to come. Clara shifted her bag and walked down. She knocked twice on the front door, waited, knocked again, and heard heavy footsteps, the boots of someone who walked like they were trying to leave marks. The door opened. Silas Mercer stood in it. He was not what she'd imagined either. The advertisement had given her a voice but not a face, and she'd filled in the blank with something generic, middle-aged, tired, grateful for help. What she got instead was a man who looked like he'd been assembled specifically to resist things. Wide through the shoulders, a jaw that had made up its mind about something years ago and never revisited the question. Dark eyes under heavy brows, the kind of eyes that are not unfriendly, but are not open either. He looked at her the way you look at a fence you're not sure will hold. "Miss Vance," he said. It wasn't a question, exactly, but it wasn't quite a greeting. "Mr. Mercer." She held out her hand. He shook it briefly, firmly, and with the faint surprise of a man who was expecting her to be more tentative about it. "You're earlier than I thought," he said. The stage was on time. He stepped back from the door. She took that as an invitation and walked in. The inside of the house told a more honest story than the outside. The kitchen was functional but joyless, pots clean, surfaces wiped, but no sense that anyone had cooked a real meal in it recently. Just food heated out of obligation and consumed without pleasure. There was a coat rack with 2 coats on it, one large and one very small. A pair of child's boots on the mat, one of them turned over. A window above the dry sink that looked out on the backyard where the kitchen garden sat in gray November defeat. The crying had stopped when she knocked. Now there was only silence from the other room. $3 to start, Silas said, standing behind her slightly, as though he hadn't quite committed to being in the same room. "The rest at month's end if things work." The advertisement said 8. "I said 3 to start." Clara set her bag down by the door, not the bedroom. She'd find that later and turned to look at him. "Mr. Mercer, I've come 200 miles. Either I'm here to work or I'm not. $3 says you're not sure. $8 says we both have a deal." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read what was behind it, anger maybe, or something closer to reluctant respect, the way a man's looks when someone does something he would have done himself. 8, he said. "Good." She reached down, picked up her bag. "Where do I sleep?" He showed her the small bedroom off the kitchen, narrow bed, thin curtains, a hook on the back of the door. Adequate. She put her bag down and turned around. Silas was still in the doorway. "The other housekeepers," he started. "I heard there were 3. They left." "I know. It wasn't me," he said, and something in the way he said it told her it had cost him something to say that. Not a man who explained himself often. It was Nellie. Clara nodded once. "I'd like to meet her." He looked like he wanted to warn her about something and couldn't find the right words for it, which in Clara's experience usually meant the warning was complicated. Finally he said, "She's in the parlor," and walked away. Clara followed. Nellie Mercer was 4 years old and sitting in the corner of the parlor with her arms wrapped around a rag doll in a way that was less like playing and more like guarding. The doll was made from flour sack fabric, stuffed soft, with button eyes that didn't quite match and a small mouth embroidered in red thread. Most of its windows were dark. One of its arms had been reattached clumsily with thick brown thread that was a completely different color than the rest of the seam. Nellie herself was thin and fair-haired, with her father's dark eyes, and an expression that had no business being on a 4-year-old's face, the expression of someone who has already decided that trust is a limited resource and is conserving what little they have. She did not look up when Clara came in. Clara did not crouch down to her level or use the voice adults use on children they are trying to coax. She simply stopped a respectful distance away and said, matter-of-factly, "Is that Juniper?" Nellie's head came up. Her eyes went to Clara's face with an expression that was almost accusatory, as though she suspected a trick. "How do you know her name?" "I don't. I was asking." Pause, then yes. "She looks tired," Clara said. "She's been carried a long way today, I think." Nellie looked down at the doll and back up. "She doesn't get tired." "You're right. I misspoke." Clara turned slightly, looked around the parlor. "Is there a good chair for her, or does she prefer the floor?" The look on Nellie's face was something Clara would remember for a long time, the look of a child who has been preparing for a fight so long that the absence of one is disorienting. "She likes the chair by the window," Nellie said finally, very quietly. But Papa said no dolls on the furniture. Clara looked at the chair, then at Nellie. "That seems like a rule your father made for himself," she said carefully. I'll have a conversation with him about Juniper specifically. She went back to the kitchen without waiting to see Nellie's reaction. Silas was there, putting a pot on the stove with the particular efficiency of a man who has learned to cook out of necessity rather than any desire to. Juniper, Clara said. He turned. What? The doll. Your daughter told me you've banned dolls from the furniture. He set the pot down. She puts it on the table at supper. It's not hygienic. She wants Juniper to eat with her. It's a rag doll. She knows that, Clara said. She still wants it. She paused, letting that sit for a moment. When does Nellie eat? 6 o'clock. Then we'll need to set an extra place. He stared at her. For a doll. For Juniper. Clara opened the cabinet and began taking stock of what was inside, not organizing yet, just looking. Mr. Mercer, I'm not telling you how to raise your child, but your last 3 housekeepers left, and you said it was because of Nellie. And Nellie in that parlor is not a difficult child. She's a lonely one. There's a difference. And the difference in how you treat it changes everything. The kitchen went quiet enough that she could hear the fire in the stove, the small snap and settle of it. Silas didn't answer her, but he didn't argue either. At 6 o'clock that evening, the supper table had 4 places set, 1 for Silas, 1 for Nellie, 1 for Clara, and 1 smaller one at the corner, a saucer with a tiny portion of what was on the others, set carefully, with a small folded napkin. Most of its windows were dark. Nellie stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at that 4th place for a long moment without speaking. She likes corn, Nellie said finally, better than carrots. Then Juniper and I are alike, Clara said, setting a dish on the table. I'll remember that. Nellie came to the table, sat down, arranged Juniper in the corner seat with the focus of a small person doing something very serious. Silas sat across from them both. He looked at the 4th place setting for a brief moment. Something moved across his face. Unnamed, quick, and then he picked up his fork and said nothing. That was the first supper at Briar Hollow. Clara ate her corn and her bread and her small portion of salt beef, and she said very little because she had learned that silence at the right moment is not emptiness, it's an invitation. And sure enough, halfway through the meal, Nellie said, apropos of nothing, Juniper's arm got broke once. I noticed it had been fixed, Clara said. Papa fixed it. Nellie glanced at Silas in a way that was brief and complicated, full of a love she didn't yet know how to say cleanly. He's not very good at sewing. He did the important part, Clara said. He fixed it. Silas didn't look up from his plate, but something around his jaw loosened, just slightly, the way a thing does when it's been held tight for too long. After supper, Clara washed the dishes. Through the kitchen window, she could see the November dark settling over the flat land, no trees, no hills, just the enormous Kansas sky and the cold coming down out of it like something that had made up its mind. Her first night in a strange house, in a strange town, after 2 years of trying to outrun something she was beginning to suspect, was not geography at all. Her hands were in the wash water. Her reflection in the dark window was vague and honest, a tired woman of 30, who had been offered $8 a month and a narrow bed, and the chance, possibly, to be useful again. She didn't let herself think about Colorado. Not yet. That particular door stayed shut. Behind her, she heard Nellie's footsteps in the hall, small and determined, and then, very clearly, Silas's voice, low and careful, "Did you say good night to Miss Vance?" A pause. Then Nellie appeared in the kitchen doorway, Juniper tucked under one arm. She looked at Clara with those dark, serious eyes. "Good night, Miss Vance," she said formally. And then Juniper liked the corn. "I'll remember for next time," Clara said. Nellie disappeared. Clara turned back to the dishes. Outside, the wind had started in earnest, the kind of Kansas wind that isn't hostile exactly, just indifferent, the way a very large thing is indifferent to a very small one. The farmhouse settled around her, creaking and adjusting to the cold. She was aware, standing there, that this was only the first night, that everything could still go wrong, that she had a past in Colorado that was still sitting somewhere between a courthouse and a rumor, waiting for someone with enough persistence to pull it into the light. She was aware of all of that. And still, for the first time in a long time, she had the odd sensation that she was at least in the right place to figure something out. That was all she let herself think. She dried her hands, hung the towel, and went to bed in the narrow room off the kitchen. Through the thin wall, she could hear the house breathing, the stove cooling, The wind at the corners, and somewhere down the hall, very faintly, a little girl talking to her doll in the particular serious tone that children use when they are saying the things that actually matter. Clara stared at the ceiling in the dark. The farmhouse lamp threw a thin strip of light under her door. She had seen that light when she arrived warm and small against all that dark, and she had walked because she needed work, because she was cold, because she had nowhere else to go. She hadn't known then what she was actually walking toward. She still didn't, but she was beginning, just barely, to wonder. The cold settled into Briar Hollow the way it always did on the Kansas plains, not all at once, but incrementally, the way a difficult truth arrives. One morning you wake up, and the water in the wash basin has a thin skin of ice on it, and you understand that winter has stopped being a threat and started being a fact. Clara had been at the farm for 11 days when that happened. She lay in the narrow bed for a moment after she woke, listening to the house. The stove had gone low overnight. She could tell by the quality of the cold in the air, the way it had weight to it now instead of just edge. Down the hall, nothing moved yet. Silas was usually up before her, which she'd discovered irritated her slightly, in a way she couldn't entirely justify because there was no rule that said the housekeeper had to be first. But she'd started setting her own internal clock earlier and earlier, which meant she was winning a competition nobody had agreed to enter. She got up, dressed fast, went to the kitchen, and rebuilt the fire in the stove before anyone else appeared. Kitchen was becoming familiar in the way a tool becomes familiar. You stop thinking about where things are and just reach for them. The cast iron skillet lived on the left hook. The coffee grinder was on the shelf above the window, slightly too high for comfort, but workable. The pantry had been reorganized twice now, the second time more permanently than the first, after Clara discovered that Silas had a habit of putting things back in whatever space was convenient rather than where they actually belonged. She'd mentioned this once. He'd looked at her, the way a man looks when he knows he's wrong and resents being right about it. She had not mentioned it again. The pantry stayed organized. While the coffee heated, she started biscuits, because she'd noticed in her first week that Silas ate whatever was put in front of him without comment, which in her experience meant nothing, because men who grew up eating poor learned to accept food without expressing preference, and that was not the same as having none. What he did do, she noticed, was eat 2 of everything on mornings when there were biscuits, and 1 of everything on mornings when there weren't. She filed that away. Nellie appeared in the kitchen at 6:30 in her nightgown, and both socks an improvement from the first week when she'd arrived every morning with one bare foot and the other half-shod, hopping slightly, as though getting fully dressed, was something she did in stages throughout the morning. She had Juniper under one arm. "It's cold," Nellie announced. Clara agreed, not turning from the stove. "My breath made a cloud in my room. That means the stove needs feeding earlier. I'll remember." Clara glanced back at her. "Did you bring Juniper's blanket?" Nellie looked down at the doll, then back up. The expression was one Clara had started to decode, a small flicker of surprise that anyone had remembered a detail about Juniper, followed immediately by the careful expression of someone who doesn't want to seem too pleased about anything. "She doesn't need it," Nellie said. "She's not cold. Then she's tougher than both of us." Nellie climbed onto her chair. She did this with great determination and some difficulty, refusing help every time, and set Juniper in the corner spot at the table. The corner spot had become established fact by now, the way certain things become established in households without anyone officially declaring them. Juniper sat there. That was where Juniper sat. Silas came in at 10 minutes to 7, coat already on, boots already laced. He glanced at the stove, then at Clara, then at the biscuits. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's ready," Clara said. He poured a cup and stood by the window drinking it, looking out at the yard. Clara had noticed this was his version of thinking he didn't pace or drum his fingers or do any of the things people do when they are working something through. He just stood, very still, and looked at something in the middle distance, and she had learned to let him have that without filling it. "East fence," he said finally. "What about it?" "2 posts are down. Wind took them overnight." He drank. "I'll need the afternoon. I'll have supper later, then." He nodded. That was the whole conversation, and it was fine. They had developed, in 11 days, a vocabulary of necessary things. It was not warmth exactly, but it was functional. And Clara had been in enough households to know that functional could last a long time, where warmth sometimes burned itself out fast. What she had not anticipated was the town. She'd expected some scrutiny. She was new. She was a single woman. She'd appeared from somewhere unspecified to take up residence in a widower's house. She understood the arithmetic of that. What she hadn't expected was the speed and specificity of the conclusions. She found out about the talk on a Tuesday when she went into the dry goods store for salt and a spool of dark thread, and Mabel Holt, wife of the dry goods owner, a woman who managed to appear helpful, while being the opposite, greeted her with a smile that had too many teeth in it. "Miss Vance," Mabel said, "how are you settling in?" "Fine, thank you," Clara said. "And Silas?" "He must be so relieved to have help with the house." "I expect so," Clara said, scanning the shelf for the right thread weight. "Been so hard for him, you know." "Since Ruth," Mabel said the name with the particular softness women use when they want you to feel the weight of someone who came before you. "Ruth kept that house beautifully. Wonderful cook. The whole town loved her." Clara found the thread. "Do you have salt in the 20-pound bags?" "I'm sure it must be strange." Mabel continued, undeterred, coming into a home where someone else's presence is still so strong. Clara put the thread on the counter. "The salt," she said, "in the 20-pound bag, if you have it." Mabel blinked. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated. "Of course," she said, and went to get it. Clara paid for her things and walked out and stood for a moment in the cold air outside the store, recalibrating herself. She was not angry. Anger was a luxury she'd learned to spend carefully, and Mabel Holt was not worth the expenditure. But she was aware more sharply now than on the way in that she was being watched and measured and discussed, and that the conclusions being drawn were not ones she would have drawn herself. She walked back to the farm with the salt and the thread and did not mention it to Silas. She didn't mention it the following week either, when she passed two women, when she met Queen of Town and the farm, and they stopped talking as she approached and resumed the moment she was past, in that particular way that people don't realize is obvious. She didn't mention it when the pastor's wife came to call ostensibly to welcome her to the community, actually to take inventory, and asked 3 times in different ways how Clara had come to hear about the position in Kansas. Through an advertisement, Clara said, each time, pleasantly. Pastor's wife left unsatisfied. Silas noticed none of this, or if he did, he didn't say so. He was not a man who spent a lot of time thinking about what people were saying in town, which Clara suspected was partly genuine indifference, and partly the armor of a man who had learned that grief makes you interesting to people you don't want to be interesting to. He'd lost his wife 18 months ago. Clara knew this because she'd found a small portrait wrapped in cloth in the back of the kitchen shelf, not hidden exactly, just put away. Ruth Mercer had been a pretty woman with a direct look in her eyes that Clara found she respected. She'd wrapped it back up and put it exactly where she'd found it. The weeks moved forward with the relentlessness that winter on the plains insists on. Clara learned the farm's rhythms and the farm's weaknesses, the window in the north bedroom that leaked cold air until she stuffed the gap with old cloth, the root cellar door that swelled with moisture and needed a specific technique to open, the way the eastern pasture gate swung wrong and needed to be lifted as well as pushed. She fixed what she could fix, noticed what she couldn't, and made lists in her head because she'd never gotten into the habit of writing things down, which was a flaw she recognized without feeling compelled to correct. Nellie, meanwhile, was becoming a different child than the one who'd sat in the corner of the parlor on the first day. Not dramatically, she didn't suddenly become easy or cheerful or forthcoming, but the specific wariness had shifted. She still watched Clara from distances, still tested things in small ways that were sophisticated for a 4-year-old asking questions she already knew the answers to see if the answer would change, making small messes near Clara's workspace and watching to see what happened, occasionally claiming Juniper had said something critical about some decision Clara had made, as a kind of proxy for her own feelings. Clara handled all of it without making a production of it. When Nellie asked a question she already knew the answer to, Clara gave the same answer she'd have given otherwise. When there were small messes, she cleaned them without comment. When Juniper's opinions were reported to her, she considered them seriously. "Juniper thinks I should have put more sugar in the pie," Nellie reported one afternoon. Clara said, "Juniper is probably right. I was being conservative. I'll adjust next time." Nellie stared at her for a long moment, then went back to whatever she'd been doing. The real shift happened on a Wednesday in the third week, during a snowstorm that came in hard from the northwest and kept everyone inside from noon onward. Silas was doing what needed doing. Clara and Nellie were in the kitchen, and Clara was darting a sock that had a hole in the heel that had gotten worse from being ignored. Zelia's windows were dark, and Nellie was nominally playing on the floor, but was actually watching Clara with the intensity of a child who has decided to learn something. "Can you teach me?" Nellie asked. Clara looked up. "To darn?" "Yes." Clara considered this. It was not a simple thing, not for a 4-year-old, but Nellie's hands were dexterous, and she had focus that most adults would have envied. "Come here then," she said. Nellie climbed up onto the chair beside her. Clara handed her a smaller, needle-threaded, knotted at the end, and showed her how to anchor stitch at the edge of the hole. Nellie made 4 stitches, and then poked herself with the needle and gasped, more from surprise than pain. "Put your finger in your mouth for a moment," Clara said. "It'll pass." "Did that happen to you when you learned?" "About 40 times, Clara said. "I still do it sometimes when I'm not paying attention." Nellie took her finger out of her mouth and looked at it, and then at Clara with an expression that was assessing something. "Where did you live before?" she asked. Clara kept her eyes on her own work. "Different places." "Why different places?" "Some people stay in one place," Clara said, "and some people move around until they find the right one." She tied off a thread. "I was one of the second kind." "Did you have a little girl?" The question landed quietly, without warning, the way a 4-year-old's questions do no awareness of what they're touching, just curiosity in its purest form. Clara was still for a moment. "No," she said, "I didn't." "Do you want one?" Clara looked at her then at Nellie's face, so serious and intent under its fine pale hair, Juniper propped on the table beside her, with her mismatched button eyes aimed at nothing. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that I hadn't let myself think about it for a while." Nellie seemed to consider this as an answer. Then she picked up her needle again. "Juniper thinks you should stay," she said, in a tone designed to suggest this was purely Juniper's opinion and nothing to do with her. "I'll take that under advisement," Clara said. Nellie made 3 more stitches uneven, pulled too tight, but hers. "What does under advisement mean?" "It means I'm thinking about it seriously." "Oh." Nellie nodded as though this was satisfactory. "Good." Clara went back to her darning. The storm pressed at the windows. Kitchen was warm. And for a few minutes neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of thing, a 4-year-old and a 30-year-old sitting in a kitchen in a snowstorm, learning that silence in the right company doesn't need to be filled. Silas came in from the barn at 4, snow on his coat and his boots, leaving wet marks on the floor. He'd just looked at Clara for mopping 3 days ago. He stopped when he saw Nellie with the needle. "What are you doing?" he said. "Darning," Nellie said with great dignity. "Miss Vance is teaching me." He looked at Clara. She kept her face neutral. "She's doing well," she said. He looked at the sock in Nellie's hands. He looked at Nellie's face. Something moved behind his eyes that Clara couldn't name, not quite pain, not quite joy, something in the complicated territory between them that has no clean word. He took off his coat and hung it without saying anything, and went to get coffee, and Nellie kept darning. But later, much later, after Nellie was in bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime self, Clara was banking the kitchen stove when Silas came back through. He stopped in the doorway. She hasn't sat still long enough to learn anything since. He stopped, restarted, since before her mother got sick. Clara straightened up. "She's sharp," she said. "She'll pick it up fast when she decides she wants something." "She decides she wants things," Silas said. "She doesn't always let on what they are." "No," Clara said. "She doesn't." He stood there for a moment. She was aware that he was working towards something and not quite getting there, which was his normal mode of operation. When it came to things that mattered, he was direct about fences and grain and water, and entirely indirect about everything else. Finally he said, "She talks to you." "Sometimes," Clara said. "She doesn't do that," he said. "With most people." Clara picked up the ash bucket. "I think she does it when she decides it's worth the risk," she said. "She's cautious, not cold." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected, but hadn't been able to articulate. "Good night, Miss Vance," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He went down the hall. Clara stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, ash bucket in hand, ticking as it cooled. Outside, the storm had blown itself mostly out and left the yard coated in white that the moonlight turned strange and clean. She was aware that something had shifted again, subtly, the way the good shifts always happen, not dramatically, but like a door that was stuck and has given, just slightly, under steady pressure. She was also aware that Dry Creek hadn't stopped talking. She found out the full extent of it on a Friday in late November, when she went to the post office to send a letter entirely ordinary regarding a small debt she was paying off in installments to a seamstress in Denver, nobody's business but her own, and Elias Rook. The local attorney was coming down the post office steps as she was going up, and he stopped. She knew him by sight. He was a thin man in his late 40s, with a serious mouth and eyes that assessed things professionally and then put them in categories. He was, she'd gathered, the only attorney within 30 miles, and busy enough to be particular about his time. Miss Vance, he said, stopping. Not unfriendly, but not casual either. I've heard a great deal about you, I imagine, Clara said. Nothing worth repeating, he said, which surprised her. I say that because the things I've heard don't match what I've observed, and I find myself preferring observation. Studied him. What have you observed? That Silas Mercer's farm has smoke from the chimney at reasonable hours, that his daughter was seen laughing on the main street last week, which, I'm told, hasn't happened in some time, and that you appear to be a woman who knows exactly what she's doing even when nobody's watching. He paused. In my experience, that combination is rarer than it should be. Clara looked at him for a moment. Is there something you need, mister? Rook, or are you taking an inventory? Neither, he said. I'm introducing myself properly, which I should have done sooner. Elias Rook. He held out his hand. She shook it. If you ever need anything in a legal capacity, my office is above the hardware store. He gave her a small, precise nod and continued down the street. Clara watched him go, and then went up the post office steps, and mailed her letter, and thought about what it meant that in a town full of people who'd already decided who she was, one person had bothered to watch first. It was the following week that Rufus Calder arrived in Dry Creek. She didn't know who he was, at first. He came in 2 carriages, which was unusual for November, unusual for Dry Creek in general, and the carriages were well kept in Nornet, and the horses were better than anything in the local livery. He took rooms at the only boarding house, and he ate at the hotel dining room, and he had the particular quality that powerful men acquire when they have been powerful, long enough that they've stopped noticing the rooms they walk into. Clara saw him on the main street the day after he arrived. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a parcel, and he was crossing the street, and they passed each other without introduction. But she noticed the way he looked at the town, not with interest, but with assessment, the look of someone pricing things. She filed it away. She found out who he was 2 days later, when Silas came in from town with a face that had done something complicated and difficult and was still working through it. He sat down at the kitchen table, not his usual chair, the other one, which told her something about his mental state, and put a folded paper on the table. Somebody from a land company, he said, name of Calder. Clara set down what she was doing. What does he want? He says he owns the creek. The words landed flat in the kitchen air, the way very bad news does sometimes not with noise, but with weight. Creek that feeds the east pasture, Clara said. Creek that feeds everything. Silas put his hands flat on the table. He's got documents. Survey papers. Says the parcel line runs right through the water source. Says he filed with the county 6 months ago and we weren't notified because he stopped. Because they say they couldn't locate the owner, meaning me. Meaning they sent the notice to an address I haven't had for 10 years. Clara looked at the paper on the table. May I? He pushed it toward her. She unfolded it. It was dense with legal language parcel numbers, survey references, section and township designations, the kind of document that is designed to be unreadable by anyone without specific training. Clara read it the way she read everything, carefully, from the beginning, not skimming. She read it twice. What's his timeline? She asked. He wants to meet next week. He'll let us buy water rights back from him. The number he's quoting, Silas stopped. The number was clearly in the range that was not possible, and they both understood that without saying it. He doesn't want to sell it, Clara said. He wants you to walk away from the farm. Silas's jaw was doing the thing she'd come to recognize, the tightening that preceded either silence or something very direct, and she'd learned to wait to see which one came. "I know that," he said. "He thinks you'll decide fighting is too expensive." "It probably is too expensive." "Probably," Clara said. She was still looking at the document. There was something in the parcel numbers, a sequence that pulled at parcel numbers, a sequence, something in her memory, something from a long time ago, from an office in Colorado, that she had spent 2 years trying not to think about. She folded the paper again carefully, along its original lines. "Can I hold on to this for a day?" Silas looked at her. "What for? I want to read it again," she said. Which was true. It was not the whole truth, but it was true. He studied her face for a moment. She'd noticed he did this when he suspected there was more to something than what was being said, and he was usually right, but he didn't always push. This time he pushed. "You know something," he said. "Not accusatory. Just certain." "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Give me a day." He gave her the day. Clara spent that evening at the kitchen table after Nellie was in bed, and Silas had gone to check the barn, with the document spread out in a stub of pencils, and the back of a used envelope she'd flattened for scratch paper. She worked through the parcel numbers slowly, tracing the survey references back to what she remembered of standard Kansas Township grid methodology, which was, uncomfortably, quite a lot. She wrote numbers down and erased them and wrote them again. She drew a rough grid from memory, marking the section lines, noting where Calder's claimed boundary would fall. And there it was, a discrepancy of 17 feet, maybe more, depending on whether the original county survey had been run from the eastern or western suspicion. And she had a strong suspicion, based on the year of the reference survey and the way Kansas county lines were platted in that particular region, that it had been run from the east, which would put Calder's claimed line 17 feet short of the water source, maybe more. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't conclusive either. She needed the original county survey document. She needed someone who could legally compel its production. She needed Elias Rook. She sat for a long moment, looking at the numbers on the flattened envelope. Kitchen was quiet. The fire was low. Her reflection in the dark window was doing the same thing she was doing, sitting very still and working through the cost of something. Cost was this: to explain what she had found, she would need to explain how she knew to look for it. And explaining that meant explaining the Colorado Land Office, which meant explaining a man named Harlan Fitch and money that had not been hers to lose, and a reputation she had not been able to recover, and a name in a county record, somewhere that she had been hoping Dry Creek, Kansas, was far enough away to make irrelevant. Maybe it still was. Maybe nobody in this county had ever heard of Harlan Fitch or the mess in Colorado. Maybe the past she'd been carrying stayed put while she used what it had taught her. She picked up the pencil and wrote the number 17 on the envelope and underlined it twice. Then she banked the stove and went to bed and lay in the dark, thinking about the difference between running from something and finally using it, and whether it was possible, after 2 years of the first, to try the second. She thought about Nellie's voice saying, "Juniper thinks you should stay." She thought about the east pasture going dry in spring if Calder got what he wanted, about the livestock, about Silas's hands flat on the kitchen table with that particular stillness that wasn't calm. That was a man holding himself together by force of habit. She thought about all of it, and the wind came up outside, and the farmhouse talked back to it in its old wooden way. And at some point, she stopped thinking and started sleeping, which was its own kind of answer. In the morning, she got up and made coffee and biscuits, and waited until Nellie was eating and occupied with trying to convince Juniper to try a bite of jam. And then she looked at Silas across the table and said, "I need to speak with Elias Rook." Silas put down his coffee cup. His eyes went to her face and stayed there. "Why?" "Because I think Calder's documents have a problem," she said. "And I think I know what it is. But I need an attorney to make it mean something legally." Kitchen went quiet in that particular way. It did when something important had just been said. Nellie, at the corner of the table, had stopped moving Juniper's arm and was watching them both. Silas said, "What kind of problem?" "The kind that might mean he doesn't own what he says he owns," Clara said. "The kind that comes from a surveying error that could have been intentional." He looked at her for a long time. "How do you know about surveying errors?" "I used to work in a land office," she said, "in Colorado." She watched him absorb that. She watched the questions assemble themselves behind his eyes. Why didn't you say so before? What were you doing there? Why did you leave? And she watched him make a decision not to ask them yet, which was, she thought, one of the more decent things anyone had done for her in a long time. All right, he said. Rook's office is open at 8. I know, she said. She poured him more coffee. He picked up the cup. Nellie reported that Juniper had decided she liked jam on Tuesdays but not Wednesdays. And could someone explain why Wednesday jam was different? And the kitchen moved back into its morning shape around them, ordinary, necessary, ongoing. But something had shifted under the surface of it. Something Clara had been holding back, at considerable personal cost, had been offered not all of it, not yet, but the first piece, the piece that mattered right now. Silas hadn't flinched. He hadn't pushed. He just said all right and picked up his coffee cup. And that, Clara thought, was worth noting. That was worth a great deal. She washed the breakfast dishes with the cold water from the pump, and the morning sun came through the kitchen window at its winter angle, low and thin and trying, and lit up the steam rising from the wash basin, and outside the east pasture sat under its skin of frost, and the creek ran through it, cold and clear and, for the moment, still theirs. For the moment. That was the thing about moments. You had to decide, while you were in them, what you were willing to do to keep them. Clara dried her hands on the towel and went to get her coat. Elias Rook's office above the hardware store was exactly what Clara expected from a man who had introduced himself by saying he preferred observation over rumor. It was small, deliberate, and almost entirely without ornament. 2 chairs across from his desk, a bookshelf with law volumes arranged by subject rather than alphabetically, which told her something about how he thought. A single window facing the main street, the glass slightly wavy the way old glass gets, so that the people passing below had a faint underwater quality to them. Rook was already at his desk when she came up the stairs. He looked up, noted her, noted that she was alone, and gestured at the chair across from him without ceremony. Mr. Mercer isn't coming, he said. He's at the farm, Clara said. I'm here on his behalf. She sat down and put the folded document on the desk between them. I need you to look at this. Rook unfolded it. He read the way she did from the beginning, carefully, not performing the reading for her benefit. She let him finish. He went back and read one section a second time, which she took as a good sign. Then he set it down and looked at her. Calder's claim, he said. Yes, I'd heard he was in town. He laced his fingers together on the desk. What am I looking for? The parcel numbers, she said. Specifically, the reference survey from 1871. I want you to compare the section line description to the original county survey document from that year. Rook was quiet for a moment. You think there's a discrepancy. I think there might be 17 feet of one, she said. Maybe more, depending on which baseline the original survey was run from. He looked at her steadily. How do you know to look for that? I worked in a land office, she said. Colorado. Several years ago. She kept her voice even. I processed survey documents. I learned what errors look like, both accidental and otherwise. Rook was the kind of man whose face didn't move much when he was thinking, which made him restful to talk to. He studied her for a moment, not with suspicion, exactly, but with the professional precision of someone deciding how much weight to put on what they're being told. Calder's operation, he said finally, has done this before. Different counties, different states. They find small landholders with water access. They file a preemptive claim using a slightly altered survey reference. The alteration is small enough that most people without specialized knowledge won't catch it. Then they either buy the rights back cheap or wait for the farmer to fold. I know, Clara said. You know because of the land office. Yes. Another pause. Outside, a wagon went by on the street below, the wheels loud on the frozen dirt. The original 1,871 county survey, Rook said, should be in the county clerk's records in Millhaven. That's 22 miles east. He picked up Calder's document again, looked at the parcel reference. If your 17 feet holds up against the original, Calder's claim doesn't reach the water source. That's what I believe, Clara said. Believing it and proving it are different things. That's why I'm sitting in your office, she said. Rook almost smiled. It was brief and professional, and she appreciated it for exactly what it was. Calder has an attorney coming from Wichita, he said. A man named Prentice. I know him by reputation. He's expensive and he's thorough, and he does not lose cases he thinks are straightforward. He set the document down. He thinks this one is straightforward. Then he hasn't seen the original survey, Clara said. No, Rook agreed. He hasn't. He was quiet for a moment, thinking through something. A land hearing can be requested through the county office. If I file today, we can likely get a date within 3 weeks. Calder's attorney will try to delay, but there are limits on how long a water rights dispute can be held in abeyance during a farming season. He looked at her. Cost something. Filing fees, travel to Millhaven, my time. How much? He named a number. It was not a small number, but it was survivable. Clara did the calculation in her head, her salary, what she'd saved, what Silas might be able to contribute without breaking what was already a thin operation. We can manage it, she said. There's another thing, Rook said, and his tone changed slightly, not harder, but more careful. Tone of someone about to say something that requires some delicacy. If you present this evidence at a hearing, Calder's attorney will want to know the source. He'll want to know how Silas Mercer's housekeeper identified a surveying discrepancy in a legal document. He paused. He'll investigate your background. It's what Prentice does. He undermines the credibility of anyone who threatens his client's position. Clara looked at him steadily. I understand that. Your time in Colorado, Rook said. Is there anything in it that Prentice could use to suggest you're unreliable? As a source, as a person. The question sat in the room between them. Clara had been waiting for some version of it since she'd walked up the stairs, and she'd made her decision about how to answer it. Built somewhere around the second cup of coffee this morning, in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from the wash basin. There was a man, she said. His name was Harlan Fitch. He was a land speculator. I worked in the county land office in Denver, and he cultivated my trust. Over about 8 months, I believed what he told me, and I introduced him to colleagues, and I gave him access to information about upcoming survey filings that wasn't public yet. She kept her voice flat and factual. He used it to file fraudulent preemption claims on 3 parcels before the original owners could respond. When it was discovered, I was questioned. I wasn't charged because I genuinely didn't know what he was doing, but my name was in the record. I lost my position. I left Colorado because the people who trusted me no longer did, and I couldn't prove to them that I hadn't known, only that I hadn't. She stopped. That's what Prentice will find. Rook was quiet for a moment. And did you know, he said. Not with accusation, just asking. No, Clara said. I didn't. He nodded once. Then we work with that. He picked up his pen. Being questioned and cleared is not the same as being guilty. Prentice will try to make it seem the same. That's his method. We counter it by being ahead of him. We disclose it ourselves. First, before he can use it as a surprise. Controlled disclosure takes the weapon out of his hands. He looked at her. But that means you'll have to say it in a public hearing, in front of whoever's in that room. Including Silas, Clara said. Including Silas. She picked up the document from the desk, folded it back along its lines, and held it for a moment. How long do I have before you need my answer? I'll start the filing process today, regardless, Rook said. We can discuss the disclosure strategy when I've confirmed what the original survey shows. Give me 4 days to get to Millhaven and back. He paused. Miss Vance. For what it's worth, whatever happened in Colorado, it gave you the knowledge to catch what most people would have missed. That's not nothing. It's not enough on its own, she said. No, he agreed. But it's the beginning. She left his office and walked back down the stairs into the cold air of the main street, and stood for a moment with the document in her hands. Across the street, at the boarding house, one of Calder's carriages was pulled up at the front. She couldn't see Calder, but she knew he was in there somewhere, certain of his position, expecting the usual outcome. She put the document in her coat pocket and walked back toward the farm. Silas was in the Eastex pasture when she got back, repairing the section of fence that had been giving him trouble since the first hard wind. He worked with the focused economy of a man doing something he'd done 1,000 times, driving posts, stringing wire, testing tension with his weight against it. She walked out to him rather than waiting, because she had learned that delivering news to Silas Mercer was easier when he had something to do with his hands. She told him about Rook. She told him about the discrepancy and the original survey and the filing and the cost. He listened with his hands on the fence wire, not looking at her, but not looking away either. Looking at the middle distance, which she'd come to understand was his version of attention. When she finished, he said, "And Rook thinks it'll hold up. He thinks it might," she said. "He won't know until he sees the original survey." Silas was quiet for a moment, 3 weeks, roughly. "Calder's going to know we're fighting," he said. "He already knows. Question is whether he thinks we can win." She paused. "Right now he thinks we can't. That's our advantage. Prentice will come in, expecting this to be settled in an afternoon." Silas pulled on the fence wire, once testing it, or thinking, or both. "What aren't you telling me?" he said. She'd expected that question too. He was better at reading omission than she'd initially given him credit for. "There are things about my time in Colorado that will come out in the hearing," she said. "Things I should have told you before. I'd like to explain them to you properly. Not here." She glanced at the sky, at the angle of the light. At supper, maybe. After Nellie's in bed. He looked at her then directly, fully, the way he didn't always. "Is it bad?" he said. "It's complicated," she said. "And I didn't know how to say it. And I probably should have said it sooner." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the fence. "Tonight then," he said. She nodded and walked back to the house. The afternoon was ordinary, in the way that afternoons before difficult evenings always are full of small tasks that occupy your hands while your mind keeps running the other thing. Clara made bread, which required attention. She gave it partially. She helped Nellie with the buttons on a dress that had been giving her trouble. She swept the kitchen floor twice, which she realized when she found herself reaching for the broom again. Nellie noticed. "You already swept it," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Are you worried about something?" Clara looked at her. Nellie was sitting at the table with a piece of brown paper and a lead pencil, attempting to draw Juniper's portrait, which was going the way 4-year-old portraiture goes with great intention and somewhat abstract results. "I'm thinking about something," Clara said. "Is it bad thinking or figuring out thinking?" "Both at once," Clara said. "Can that happen to you too?" Nellie considered this with the seriousness she gave to genuine questions. "Yes," she said finally. "Sometimes I think about Mama, and it's both kinds." Clara set the broom against the wall and sat down across from her. "That makes sense," she said. Nellie added a circle to her drawing that might have been Juniper's head. "Papa does that too," she said, without looking up. "Sometimes I see him doing both kinds thinking, but he doesn't say so. He just gets quiet." "People do that," Clara said. "Quiet isn't always empty." "I know," Nellie said. She held up the drawing, examined it, put it back down. "You're both kinds thinking right now, but you're not getting quiet." "No," Clara said. "I'm sweeping floors twice." Nellie looked at her with those dark eyes and then made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, carefully controlled, as though she wasn't sure yet whether something was funny enough to fully commit to. But the edge of it was there. Clara counted it. She put supper on at 5, and at 6 they ate, the 4 of them, same as every night. Juniper in the corner spot with a portion of what was on the others. The conversation at supper was Nellie's, mostly, which was usually how it went now. Described the drawing she'd made, the attempt to capture Juniper's face, the philosophical problem of whether a doll with button eyes could be drawn accurately, since buttons didn't look like real eyes. Silas listened and occasionally asked questions that were slightly beside the point but showed he was paying attention. Clara ate and said appropriate things and watched the two of them across the table. This man and his daughter, so similar in their careful speech, their reserve, their moments of unexpected directness, and thought about what she was going to say later. Nellie went to bed at 7:30, after the usual negotiations, about exactly which position Juniper should sleep in and whether the quilt counted as enough warmth, or whether the additional blanket from the chest was needed. Clara had learned to let this process run its course without trying to shorten it, which Silas had not yet fully mastered. He had a tendency to move toward resolution before Nellie was ready for it, which produced friction that wasn't necessary. Clara caught his eye once across the hallway and gave a small shake of her head. Stopped. Let Nellie settle Juniper's sleeping arrangements on her own terms. When Nellie was finally quiet, they came back to the kitchen. Silas poured coffee for both of them without asking. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table, where she'd read Calder's document, where Nellie darned her first stitches, where Juniper had been given her corner place, and Clara wrapped her hands around the mug and told him about Colorado. She told it straight. No preamble, no qualifications up front, no attempt to manage his impression of it before he heard the facts. She'd learned, in the years between then and now, that managing people's impressions before you gave them information was actually a form of dishonesty, even when it felt like protection. She told him about the land office job, about Harlan Fitch, about the 8 months, during which she'd trusted a man who was calculating his advantage from the first conversation. She told him about the introductions she'd made, the access she'd provided, the 3 landowners who'd lost their preemptions, rights, because of the claims Fitch filed using information she'd given him without understanding why he wanted it. She told him about the investigation and the cleared finding, and the way a cleared finding in a small community is not the same as being believed. She told him she'd left because staying had become a form of slow suffocation. Silas listened the way he listened to everything important, with his hands around his mug and his eyes on her face, and without interrupting. The fire in the stove settled once, a small internal adjustment, and neither of them looked away from the other. When she finished, he said, "You didn't know what he was doing." "No," she said, "but you blamed yourself anyway." She considered that. "I blamed myself for being readable," she said finally. "For being the kind of person who could be pointed at a thing and trust what I was told about it without asking the right questions. That felt like my fault, even if the deception wasn't. That's not the same as being guilty of something. I know that now," she said. "I knew it then too, in the part of my mind that deals with facts. The other part," she stopped. The other part was harder to convince. Silas looked at his mug for a moment, then back at her. "What Calder's doing," he said. "Is it the same as what Fitch did?" "Similar mechanics," she said. "Different man. But yes, the method is the same. Find a weak point in a survey record, file a claim that looks valid to anyone who doesn't know what to look for, and rely on the other party not having the expertise to challenge it." She paused. "The difference is that this time I know what I'm looking at." He was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the night was very dark and very cold, and the stars were out, which on the Kansas plains in winter meant a clarity that was almost aggressive. Every star present, nothing softened by cloud. "Prentice will use Colorado to make you look unreliable," Silas said. "Rook says yes, and you're willing to go into that hearing anyway." She looked at him. "Aren't you?" Something moved across his face. He set his mug down. "Clara," he stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She didn't make anything of it visibly, but she noted it. "You've been in this house 7 weeks. You don't know Briar Hollow enough to walk into a room where someone's going to drag your worst year through the mud." "I know that," she said. "I'm not doing it because I owe the farm. I'm doing it because Calder is doing to you exactly what Fitch did to those landowners in Colorado, and I have the knowledge to stop it, and not using it because it's uncomfortable would make me a coward." She paused. "I've spent 2 years running from what I learned in that land office. I'd like to try using it instead." Silas looked at her for a long time. Couldn't entirely read his expression. There was something in it she hadn't seen from him before, something less armored than his usual face, and it made her look slightly away, which she didn't normally do. "All right," he said. Again, just that. Same thing he'd said at the breakfast table that morning, in the same tone which she was starting to understand was not inadequacy with words, but the opposite, the compression of something large into something he actually meant. She nodded, drank her coffee. They sat for a few minutes more without speaking, not uncomfortably, just 2 people in a kitchen at night who had just said difficult things and were letting the air settle around them. Then Silas said, "The first housekeeper who came before you. She lasted 4 days." Clara looked at him. "What happened?" "Nellie put Juniper in her bed," he said. "As I don't know. Test maybe." The woman screamed. Clara stared at him. She screamed. She thought it was an animal. In the dark, he was looking at his mug, but the corners of his mouth had done something. Nellie didn't try to explain. She just decided the woman was unsuitable, and that was that. Clara looked away and covered her mouth with one hand for a moment. When she was confident she could speak without the wrong tone in her voice, she said, "And the second one refused to set a place for Juniper at the table." He paused. "Nellie didn't speak to her for 3 days, just stared. Apparently it became unbearable. The third? She was perfectly pleasant," he said, "but she called Juniper that old thing on the second day." Nellie heard her. He looked up. "She was gone by morning. I don't know exactly what Nellie said to her. I suspect I never will. Clara was quiet for a moment. That child, she said finally. Yes, Silas said. There was something in his voice when he said it complicated, tired, full of a love that had no clean outlet because the person he wanted to tell it to was gone, and the one who remained was 4 years old and fierce, and he didn't know how to reach her most of the time. She's been fighting for something since before she had words for what it was. She'll be all right, Clara said. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But I believe it anyway. There's a difference. He looked at her. You keep doing that, he said, making distinctions between things that sound like the same thing. They're not the same thing, she said. I know, he said. That's why I notice it. The fire in the stove had gone low. Clara got up and added wood to it, not because it needed it desperately, but because moving helped when she'd been sitting still with something for too long. She stood for a moment with the stove door open, watching the fresh wood catch. Rook goes to Millhaven in 4 days, she said. If the original survey shows what I think it shows, we'll have the hearing within 3 weeks. She shut the stove door. In the meantime, don't say anything to Calder if he contacts you again. Don't negotiate. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge anything he puts in writing. Let Rook be the voice. I know how to deal with men like Calder, Silas said. I know you do, she said. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement if he'd let it get all the way there. Good night, Clara, he said. Good night, Mr. Mercer, she said. He went down the hall. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, then turned off the lamp and went to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house, the stove's slow cooling, the wind, Nellie's occasional small sound down the hall, particular quality of the dark, in a place where there are no neighbors close enough to see light from, and she ran through what was coming. 4 days until Rook left for Millhaven. The week plus he'd need to get there, access the records, and return. The hearing itself, the room, Prentice's strategy, the moment when Colorado would be said aloud, a public space. She ran through all of it and found that she was not afraid, exactly. Afraid would have been cleaner. What she was, instead, was tired of being afraid, which was different, and which had its own kind of use. Rook returned from Millhaven on a Tuesday, 8 days after he left, and he came to Briar Hollow directly rather than sending word, which told Clara something before he opened his mouth. She saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window and called out to Silas in the barn and met Rook at the porch steps. His face was doing something careful and professional, which was the closest it came to excitement. The original survey was run from the eastern baseline, he said, before he was all the way up the steps. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. 17 feet, she said. 22, Rook said. The parcel description Calder's claim references doesn't reach the water source by 22 feet under the correct baseline interpretation. He looked at her with that small, precise expression that was his version of satisfaction. His attorney filed against a different parcels than the one on record. Whether that was intentional manipulation or an error in his own survey contractor's work, I can't say with certainty. But it doesn't matter, legally. The claim doesn't hold. Silas had come from the barn. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, still holding a length of fence wire. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. 22 feet, she said. What does that mean? He said. It means the creek is yours, Rook said. It means it always was. The three of them stood there for a moment in the cold December air, the farmhouse at their backs, the east pasture behind Silas, with its frozen grass and the creek running through it, cold and entirely indifferent to the human drama it had just been the center of. Silas said slowly, and Calder? The hearing will make it official, Rook said. I've already filed. The date is December 28th. We appear before the county land commissioner above the Dry Creek post office. Calder's attorney will be there. We present the original survey against his claim and let the evidence make the argument. He looked at Clara. You'll need to be there. You'll need to explain how you identified the discrepancy. Prentice will challenge your credibility. I know, she said. And you're prepared for that? Yes, she said. Silas looked at her, that direct, full look that she'd learned meant he was deciding something. So am I, he said, quietly, without theater. Whatever he brings up about Colorado, I'll be there. She looked at him. There was something she needed to say, and something she was not ready to say, and they were almost the same thing. So she said neither of them, and just nodded once firmly. The hearing was 17 days away. In those 17 days, Dry Creek reorganized itself in the particular way small towns do when a thing has become too big to ignore. The gossip shifted from Clara's personal reputation to the land dispute, which made it feel, paradoxically, more personal. Calder had supporters in town, men who'd done business with his company before, who believed that water rights consolidation was inevitable and profitable and might as well start here. They sat in the dry goods store and the hotel dining room and said things about how Silas Mercer should take the buyout offer and move on, which Clara heard secondhand through the particular telephone of small-town word of mouth. She said nothing. She had found that she was very good at saying nothing when the situation required it, which was a skill she'd developed in the land office years, sitting in rooms where men were saying things they'd later regret or depend on, and keeping her own face quiet and her own notes careful. Nellie, who understood almost none of the adult mechanics of what was happening, understood perfectly well that something important was coming and that Clara was at the center of it. She watched Clara with the focused attention of someone storing information for later. She didn't ask direct questions. She'd learned somehow that direct questions about the big things got deflected out. But she sat very close to Clara in the evenings, close enough to be touching, doing her stitching, or her drawing, or simply listening to the adult voices talk about things she was filing away. One evening, 5 days before the hearing, Nellie looked up from her drawing and said to no one in particular, "Is the bad man going to take our water?" Silas and Clara looked at each other. "No," Silas said. "How do you know?" Nellie said. He paused. He was not a man who made promises he wasn't sure he could keep, and the pause was him deciding how sure he was. "Because Miss Vance figured out what he did wrong," he said finally, "and now we can prove it." Nellie considered this with the gravity she gave to serious things. Then she looked at Clara. "You're going to fight him," she said. "In a hearing room," Clara said, "with documents instead of fists." Nellie seemed to find this an acceptable method. "Will you win?" she said. "I think so," Clara said. "Yes." Nellie looked at Juniper the way she did when she was processing something through the doll and then back at Clara. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing. Silas, across the table, caught Clara's eye. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. But the kitchen was warm, and outside the cold was doing what December cold in Kansas does, pressing in on every window with equal indifference, and inside the three of them and Juniper were at the table under the lamp, and for a moment the approaching hearing felt distant, and Briar Hollow felt solid, and Clara let herself have that feeling for exactly as long as it lasted, which was almost long enough. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She got up at 2 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a cold cup of coffee she'd made, and, not finished, going through the sequence of what tomorrow would require. She had run through it enough times that she could do it without the paper, the parcel numbers, the baseline reference, the 22-foot discrepancy, the 1,871 survey notation that confirmed the Eastern measurement. She had it memorized the way you memorize something you cannot afford to forget. What she couldn't memorize away was the part about Colorado. Prentice would bring it up. He was a professional, and it was the most obvious vulnerability, and he would use it, because that was what men like Prentice did not, because they believed it made their client right, but because making the other side look wrong was often the same thing, legally. He would say Harlan Fitch's name in that hearing room. He would say land fraud and investigated and dismissal from public office, and let the room assemble the picture he wanted. And Clara would have to sit there and let him say it and then say the rest of it herself, the cleared finding, the facts that Prentice would be careful to leave on the floor. Rook had told her that controlled disclosure was the strategy. Say it first, say it fully, take the weapon away. She knew he was right. She also knew that knowing someone is right and being ready to do what they're right about were, as she had told Silas, different things. She sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. At some point she heard Silas's door, and then his boots in the hallway, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the cold coffee. He went to the stove, rebuilt the fire, put new coffee on. Then he came and sat across from her at the table without saying anything. She waited. He said, "When I got back from the cavalry," he stopped, started again. "I was 26. I'd seen things I couldn't. I didn't have a way to put them anywhere. I came back here and I farmed because my father farmed, and I didn't know what else to do. And for about a year, I kept thinking there was something wrong with me because I couldn't talk about it, couldn't make it make sense, couldn't turn it into a story with a point. He looked at his hands on the table. Ruth was the first person who sat with me in a room when I was like that and didn't try to fix it or explain it or push me through it. She just sat. He paused. That was the thing for me. Sitting. Clara looked at him. "You're sitting with me," she said. "I noticed you were up," he said. Seemed right. The coffee started to smell like itself. She got up and poured 2 cups and brought them back, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning with the stove warming up again and the house completely quiet and the hearing 7 hours away. "I'm ready for tomorrow," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I'm just not graceful about it," she said. "I don't do difficult things gracefully. I do them, but not gracefully." "Neither do I," he said. "I don't think that's the requirement." She wrapped her hands around the mug. Outside, the December dark was total. Inside, the lamp made a small warm circle over the table. She thought about the first night she'd arrived, seeing the farmhouse light from the rise, walking down toward it. She had nowhere else to go, believing she had come here for employment. She thought about Nellie's face when she'd set the extra place at the table. She thought about Rook and the original survey and the 22 feet that were going to have to be argued into the record in a cold room above the post office, while a man named Prentice tried to make her into a cautionary tale. She thought about all of it and drank the coffee, and Silas sat across from her without talking, and the fire in the stove grew from a rebuild into something that could be called warm. She was not graceful about difficult things, but she had never, when it came to it, failed to do them. That was going to have to be enough. The morning of December 28th arrived the way mornings do when you've been awake most of the night, waiting for them not with any particular drama, just a gray light coming through the curtain and the stove needing attention and the ordinary requirements of the day asserting themselves regardless of what the day was going to contain. Clara got up at 5. She built the fire. She made coffee. Stood at its windows were dark. She stood at the kitchen in the dark and watched the yard come slowly visible as the sky lightened, and she thought about nothing useful, which was sometimes the only honest thing left to do. Silas was up at 5:30. He came into the kitchen, looked at the coffee, poured a cup, and stood at the window beside her for a moment. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing new to say. They had said what needed saying at 2 in the morning, and again briefly, before sleep, and the rest of it was going to be said in a room above the post office at 9 o'clock in front of people neither of had chosen for an audience. Nellie woke at 6:15, which was earlier than usual, as though she sensed the particular quality of the morning. She came into the kitchen in her nightgown with Juniper under her arm and stopped at the doorway, looking at both of them standing at the window with their coffee. "Is today the day?" she said. "Yes," Silas said. She nodded very seriously and climbed into her chair. "Then I think Juniper should stay home," she said. "This isn't a place for her." Clara looked at her. "That's thoughtful," she said. "She'd be scared," Nellie said. Then in a slightly different tone, "Not me. I'm not scared." "I know," Clara said. Nellie looked at her with those dark eyes. "Are you scared?" Clara considered the question with the respect it deserved. "A little," she said. "Yes." Nellie seemed to find this reassuring rather than alarming. The honest answer usually did more for Nellie than the comfortable one. "That's okay," she said. "Being a little scared means it matters." Silas looked at his daughter over his coffee cup with an expression Clara had learned to recognize a flash of something unguarded, that he closed off quickly, the look of a man surprised by his own child. He closed it off and drank his coffee. They ate breakfast in the particular quiet of a household that has an appointment with something large. Clara made eggs and biscuits because that was what there was, and because her hands needed to be doing something specific. Nellie ate with unusual neatness, which was her version of being serious. Silas ate everything on his plate, which meant nothing and everything. At 7:30, Clara went to her room and changed into the better of her 2 dresses, dark wool, practical, not fine by any measure but clean and pressed, which in her experience was what respect for a proceeding looked like when you were working on a housekeeper's salary. She did her hair with more care than usual. She looked at herself in the small mirror On the back of the door, the same mirror she'd looked at on her first night here, in the narrow room with the thin curtains, and had the odd sensation of seeing someone different than the woman who'd arrived in October, with one bag and nothing much left to lose. Not better, necessarily, just different. More present, maybe. More in the place she was standing. She put on her coat and went back to the kitchen. Silas was already in his coat, hat in hand. He looked at her when she came in. He did not say anything about how she looked, which was correct. They were not people who said that to each other yet. And the word yet had started to appear in her thoughts about Silas Mercer without her entirely inviting it. He just nodded and picked up the document folder Rook had left with them. "Nellie's with the Haskell woman next door," he said, "until we're back." "Good," Clara said. "Rook's meeting us at the post office at 8:45. "I know," she said. They looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen. "Let's go," he said. The road into town was frozen solid, and their breath made clouds, and the horses moved with the stiff-legged efficiency of animals who know it's cold and want to get where they're going. Clara sat beside Silas on the wagon seat and watched the flat landscape past gray-brown grass, bare sky, the occasional cedar dark against everything else, and ran through the survey numbers one more time. She had them. She had always had them. But running through them was what her hands needed to do when they had nothing else. Dry Creek looked the same as it always did at 8 in the morning, which somehow surprised her. She'd half expected the town to look different on a day that felt this significant, but it was just the Mason Street and the frozen mud and the smoke from chimneys and a dog sitting outside the livery who watched them pass with complete indifference. Rook was at the base of the post office steps when they pulled up. He was wearing his good coat and carrying a document case that looked like it had been with him a long time. He looked at them both, assessed their faces, and gave a small nod. "Calder's already upstairs," he said. "His attorney arrived last night, Prentice. He's set up on the far side of the room." He paused. "There are people here. Word got out. Commissioner Aldred will run the hearing. He's a fair man, methodical. He'll let both sides speak fully before he makes any determination." "How many people?" Silas said. "Enough," Rook said, which was his diplomatic way of saying more than Clara had hoped. She'd known there would be an audience. Small towns did not let significant things happen privately. It wasn't malice, exactly, just the arithmetic of limited entertainment and genuine investment in each other's outcomes. The people of Dry Creek had opinions about Silas Mercer and Briar Hollow and Rufus Calder, and they had more than enough opinions about Clara Vance. And all of those opinions were going to be in the same room in approximately 10 minutes. She straightened her shoulders and went up the stairs. The room above the post office was used for town meetings and occasional hearings and had about it the permanent smell of old wood and pipe tobacco and decisions made in inadequate light. 2 long tables had been set facing each other across the center of the room, with a third table for the commissioner at the head. There were chairs along the walls, already mostly occupied. Clara did not look at the chairs along the walls. She looked at the far table where Rufus Calder sat. She had seen him on the street twice before this, but never in a room where they were required to acknowledge each other. He was larger than he'd seemed outside, not tall, but wide through the chest and jaw, a man whose physical presence had been useful to him for long enough that he'd stopped noticing he used it. He was in an expensive coat and an expression of composed patience that was actually arrogance with better manners. Beside him sat the attorney from Wichita. Prentice was what Clara had expected from his reputation, lean, 50s, a face that had organized itself permanently around the expression of a man who finds the other side's position mildly beneath him. He was reviewing documents, with the focus calm from someone who has already decided how this is going to go. He glanced up when Clara came in. His eyes went to her face, held for a moment, and then went back to his documents. It was the look of a man categorizing something. She sat down next to Rook and did not look away from the room. Commissioner Aldred arrived at 9, exactly a compact man in his 60s, with a white beard trimmed close and the expression of someone who has presided over enough human disputes to have stopped being surprised by any of them. He sat at the head table, arranged his papers, and without ceremony began. Land hearing in the matter of water rights attached to Briar Hollow Farm, held against a claim by the Calder Land and Water Company, he said. Both parties are present. We'll begin with the claim as filed, then the response. Mr. Prentice. Prentice rose smoothly. He had the particular courtroom ease of a man who had learned to make a room belong to him by the way he occupied space in it. He presented Calder's claim with the measured confidence of someone with something they consider already settled: the parcel numbers, the survey reference, the county filing date, the argument that the water source fell within Calder's purchased parcel and therefore the water rights were legally his. He used precise language and a tone that implied anyone suggesting otherwise was confused about basic facts. When he sat down, Clara's hands were flat on the table. Rook rose. He did not have Prentice's courtroom ease, but he had something else: the quiet authority of a man who has done his homework and knows exactly how much of an advantage that is. He laid out their challenge. The parcel numbers in Calder's filing referenced a survey from 1871. The original 1871 county survey was on record in Millhaven. He had retrieved it, had it certified. It showed a baseline measurement that placed house boundary 22 feet short of the water source. He set the certified copy of the original survey on the commissioner's table. Then he set Calder's filed claim beside it. Then he stepped back. The numbers speak for themselves, Commissioner, he said. Claimed parcel does not reach Briar Hollow's water source under the correct baseline interpretation. The claim has no legal foundation. Prentice rose before Rook had fully sat down. The survey interpretation presented is the opinion of one county attorney, and the pause was deliberate witness. Before the commissioner accepts this interpretation as authoritative, I'd like to examine the basis for it, specifically the source of the claim's identification. He looked at Clara, the housekeeper. The word housekeeper was calibrated, quite contemptuous, but positioned a reminder of her standing, her station, the question of why someone in her position would know anything about survey methodology. Commissioner Aldred looked at Clara. Miss Vance. You're the person who identified the discrepancy? Yes, she said. She stood. It wasn't scrums. She had spent enough of the previous nights deciding it would be that she trusted it now. On what basis? Aldred said. I worked for 4 years in the county land office in Denver, Colorado, she said. I processed survey filings, parcel descriptions, and boundary certifications. I know how survey baselines are established and how errors in their reference, intentional or otherwise, affect the legal reach of a parcel claim. She kept her eyes on the commissioner. When I read Calder's documents, the survey reference year and the parcel sequence suggest a baseline discrepancy. I brought it to Mr. Rook, who confirmed it against the original document. Prentice was already standing. Commissioner, if I may. Aldred nodded. Prentice said Miss Vance's time at the Denver land office ended under what circumstances? The room was very quiet. Clara had known this was coming. She had run through it so many times in the last 3 weeks that it had lost some of its power to frighten her, the way a word does when you repeat it past the point of meaning. But knowing it was coming and standing inside it were still different. I was dismissed, she said, following an investigation. An investigation into land fraud, Prentice said. An investigation related to fraudulent filings made by a speculator named Harlan Fitch, Clara said. I was questioned as part of that investigation. I was not charged. The investigation concluded that I had provided information to Fitch without knowledge of his intent to use it fraudulently. I was dismissed from my position because the land office determined I had exercised insufficient professional judgment, not because I was found guilty of any wrongdoing. Insufficient professional judgment, Prentice repeated, in a land office. And now you are offering this room your professional judgment about a survey document. I'm offering this room my knowledge of survey methodology, she said, which I gained over 4 years of professional work, and which did not disappear when I lost the position. She paused for exactly the length of time she'd decided on in the dark kitchen last night, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to seem uncertain. Mr. Prentice, the original 1871 county survey is on that table. The baseline reference is in it. The 22-foot discrepancy is in it. My history in Colorado does not change what is written in a document that existed decades before I arrived in this county. You are welcome to challenge my judgment. You cannot change the numbers. The room was still enough that she could hear the stove in the corner and someone's chair shifting, and, underneath that, her own heartbeat. which was faster than she would have preferred but steady. Prentice was quiet for a moment. He had the faces of a man recalculating. The Denver investigation, he said. Fitch, you worked with him for 8 months. I worked in the same office building as the land office during the period he was filing claims, she said. I did not work with him. He cultivated an acquaintance with me and used information from casual conversation to inform his filings. When the investigation established this, the finding was that I was deceived, not complicit. That's your characterization of the finding. That's the finding, Rook said from his seat. Commissioner, I've reviewed the Denver investigation record. Miss Vance's description of it is accurate. If Mr. Prentice has a copy of the record that says otherwise, I'd be glad to see it. Most of its windows were dark. Prentice did not produce a different record. He made 2 more attempts at the Colorado angle, approaching it from slightly different directions, the way a man does when he knows his main weapon isn't working, but hasn't yet decided to stop using it. And Clara answered each one in the same tone, with the same facts, without embellishment and without apology. The room had a quality to it that she could feel without looking at the chairs along the walls, the quality of people listening to something that was not what they'd expected. After the second attempt, Prentice shifted. He questioned the baseline methodology. This was his stronger ground, because it required technical knowledge that most of the room didn't have. Rook handled the technical portions. When Prentice pressed on a specific measurement interpretation, Rook said, Miss Vance can speak to the methodology more precisely than I can, and Clara stood again and did. She explained the Eastern Baseline Convention for that county and that survey period. She explained the parcel numbering sequence and what the discrepancies in the sequence indicated about which baseline had been used. She was not simple about it. She did not condescend to the room, but she was clear in the way that people who have actually done a thing are clear, not in the way of someone performing expertise, but of someone for whom the knowledge has texture and weight. Calder across the table was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. He had been quiet throughout, a man accustomed to letting attorneys do his talking, but there was something behind his eyes that had shifted from the composed patience he'd walked in with. It was the look of a man whose certainty is eroding and who has not yet decided what to do about it. Commissioner Aldred asked questions, good ones, which told Clara he was following the technical argument which mattered. He asked about the certification of the original survey document. He asked about the county filing process. He asked Prentice directly whether Calder's survey contractor had used a different baseline interpretation, and Prentice said yes. And Aldred asked why, and Prentice said the contractor had relied on the parcel description rather than the original baseline document, and Aldred wrote something down. Then Calder leaned over and said something quietly to Prentice. Prentice listened. Then he rose.
Commissioner, Mr.
Calder would like to request a 30-day continuance to allow his survey contractor to— No, Aldred said, pleasantly but with finality. The original survey document has been certified and presented. Parcel numbers are on record. A continuance serves no purpose except delay. We'll conclude today. He looked at both tables. I'll take 15 minutes. He went to the side of the room. People began talking the low, specific talk of people who have been holding it in during something formal. Clara sat down. Rook put his pen down beside his papers. Silas, beside her, put his hand on the table between them, not touching her, just near present. She looked at his hand, then at his face. He was looking at the commissioner's table, jaw set, waiting. He was not a man who was good at waiting, but he was doing it. Clara looked at the chairs along the walls for the first time since she'd sat down. There were more people than she'd expected. Not the entire town, but a representative portion of it, including Mabel Holt from the dry goods store, who was watching Clara with an expression that was harder to read than her usual one, something more complicated than simple suspicion, including the pastor's wife, whose inventory-taking visit in November felt like a long time ago, including 3 or 4 men Clara didn't know well but recognized as regular fixtures of the town's opinion. And near the back, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and an expression that was entirely unreadable, was a woman Clara had seen once, a woman who'd been sweeping the step of the dry goods store on the day Clara arrived, who'd watched her pass with the particular stillness of someone who'd already decided. She was watching Clara now with the same stillness. Clara held the look for a moment, then turned back to the table. 15 minutes was 12 minutes when Aldred came back. He sat down, he arranged his papers. He did not make anyone wait while he did it, which she respected. The certified copy of the 1871 county survey establishes as eastern baseline for the relevant section, he said. Under that baseline, the parcel description referenced in the Calder Land and Water Company's filing places the boundary of the claimed parcel 22 feet short of the water source in question. He paused. The claim as filed does not legally encompass the water rights to Briar Hollow Farms Creek. The filing is denied. Briar Hollow's water rights remain with the property. He set his pen down. That was it. 11 sentences. The weight of the last 3 weeks resolved into 11 sentences in the voice of a man with a white beard who was already reaching for his next document. Most of its windows were dark. The room was quiet for approximately 2 seconds. Then Nellie's voice, carrying clear from the doorway, where she had apparently been for an unknown length of time, having apparently persuaded or evaded the Haskell woman from next door with methods Clara did not know and probably did not need to said, "Did we beat him?" Every head in the room turned. Nellie stood in the doorway, in her good coat, Juniper tucked firmly under her arm, despite having declared this morning that Juniper was staying home. Her face was the face of a child who has been waiting outside a door she was told not to come through and has now come through it, and does not intend to apologize. She was looking at her father. Silas looked at his daughter in her good coat with her doll, having apparently decided that the Haskell woman was insufficient supervision. For a day this important, and something happened to his face that Clara had not seen before. It was not quite a smile, because Silas Mercer's face did not entirely know how to do that without also doing other things. It was the expression of a man who, for the first time in a long time, could breathe out. "Yes," he said, "we did." Nellie nodded, satisfied, as though this had been the expected outcome and the whole point was simply to confirm it. Then she looked at Clara, and what was on her face was different, not the satisfaction of a confirmed prediction, but something more direct, more personal, the particular look of a 4-year-old who has decided something and wants you to know. Clara looked back at her. Across the room, Rufus Calder was already moving standing, buttoning his coat, saying something low to Prentice that did not include any acknowledgement of the people he was moving past. Prentice gathered his documents with the practiced efficiency of a man who had lost before and knew how to leave a room. Neither of them spoke to Silas. Neither of them looked at Clara. She watched them go. Rook was beside her, gathering his own papers, and he said quietly, "Well done," which, from Elias Rook, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. People were on their feet. The room had developed the particular energy of an audience at the end of something that did not go the way they'd expected, some of that energy relief, some of it recalibration, some of it the slightly uncomfortable recognition that the person they'd been suspicious of had just done something worth not being suspicious of. Mabel Holt crossed the room. Clara saw her coming and had a split second of preparation for what? She wasn't sure. Some continuation of the familiar disapproval, some version of "I always knew" that would flatten what had just happened into something Mabel could manage. What she got instead was Mabel standing in front of her with an expression that had dropped some of its management. "You knew from the beginning," Mabel said, not accusing, stating it. "I suspected," Clara said, "from the beginning. And you didn't say anything. To anyone. You just went and figured it out." "There was nothing to say until there was something to prove," Clara said. Mabel looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, in a different tone, flatter, more honest, "I wasn't kind to you when you arrived." "No," Clara agreed. "I'm saying I wasn't," Mabel said, which was not quite an apology but was as close to one as Mabel Holt appeared to be capable of generating in a public room, and Clara gave her credit for it. "I know," she said. "It's all right." Mabel nodded once and moved away. The woman from the dry goods, Step, the one who'd watched Clara arrive from the beginning, came by next. Stopped. She said nothing. She simply put one hand briefly on Clara's arm and then continued on, and in its brevity and unexpectedness it meant more than anything Mabel had said. Silas had crossed the room and was picking Nellie up. She went to him with the specific relief of a child who has been brave for a long time and can now stop. She wrapped both arms around his neck and kept Juniper clutched in one fist. "The Haskell woman said to stay," Silas said into her hair. "I know." Nellie said. We're going to have a conversation about that. I know, Nellie said, is in exactly the tone of someone who has already weighed the conversation against what she wanted to do and made her decision accordingly. Silas looked at Clara over Nellie's shoulder. She looked back at him. In the busy, shuffling, voice-filled room, something was happening that required neither of them to speak about it yet, which was probably for the best, because they were in a room full of people, and neither of them did certain things publicly. Rook came to stand beside them. I'll file the ruling with the county this afternoon, he said. It'll be on record within the week. Calder's company has 30 days to appeal, but I don't anticipate they will. The original survey document is unambiguous, and Prentice knows it. He looked at Clara. What you did in there was solid. The methodology explanation was better than I could have managed. You brought the original survey, she said. That's what made it solid. You told me where to look, he said. He picked up his document case. I'll send you the final costs. Silas. He nodded at Silas and then at Clara and went down the stairs. The room was emptying. People moved toward the stairs in the conversational clusters that form at the end of public things, replaying what they'd witnessed, already beginning the process of making it into the story they'd tell later. Clarissa watched them go and felt the particular tiredness that comes after sustained effort, not the tiredness of failure, but the heavier, stranger tiredness of something that actually worked. It had a different quality. It sat differently in the body. Silas set Nellie down. Ready? He said to Clara. Yes, she said. She picked up her coat from the chair. Then she stopped, coat in hand, and looked at the room, the two tables still set face to face, the certified survey copy still on the commissioner's table, the morning light coming through the wavy glass window and making everyone slightly underwater. She thought about the night in the kitchen when she'd sat with the document, and the pencil and the flattened envelope and found the number 17. How she'd sat there for a long time, thinking about the cost of using what she knew, about Colorado and the 2 years she'd spent trying to leave it behind. She thought about all of it, and then she put on her coat. They went down the stairs, Silas first, Nellie on his hip, Clara behind them, and out into the December air of the main street, which was cold and bright and entirely itself, indifferent to what had just happened above the post office, and also, in its way, continuing regardless. Nellie squinted in the light. Can we have something hot? She said. My feet are cold. We'll stop at the hotel, Silas said. Juniper's cold too, Nellie said. Juniper, Silas said, was supposed to stay home. She doesn't listen as well as you think, Nellie said. Clara, walking beside them, looked away and looked back, and the thing that happened to her face she did not try to manage. It was not grace. It was just what it was. They walked down the main street of Dry Creek. In the December cold, the three of them and Juniper, and people who passed them on the street looked, and some of them nodded, and some of them looked longer than nodding, and one old man in front of the barber shop raised his hat. Silas nodded back. Clara kept walking. Nellie, from her position on Silas's hip, watched the old man with the hat with the gravity she gave to anything unexpected. At the hotel dining room, they got a table by the window, and Silas ordered coffee, and Nellie ordered cocoa, and the waitress brought an extra cup for Juniper without being asked, which made Nellie go very still for a moment, with an expression of pure surprise, and then arranged Juniper's cup very precisely. Silas watched this. Clara watched Silas watch this. After a while he said, without much preamble, you should know that what you said in there about Colorado, I want you to know that it doesn't change. He stopped. Started again differently. It changes nothing for me. You said that last night. She said essentially, I know. He looked at his coffee cup. I wanted to say it again. In the daylight, she looked at him. He was not comfortable saying it. Tension. She could see that, the slight tension around it, the slight inadequacy he felt in his own words, and she found that the discomfort made it more real rather than less. A man who was perfectly at ease saying something warm had probably said it many times, and it had become automatic. This had not become automatic for him. It was costing him something. Thank you, she said, simply. He nodded, drank his coffee. Nellie was explaining to Juniper that cocoa was different from coffee, and that when Juniper was older, she could have coffee, but not yet. And the reasoning she applied to this was intricate and internally consistent and entirely her own. Clara sat in the hotel dining room in Dry Creek, Kansas on December 28th, cold feet and tired eyes, and the particular sensation of someone who has put down something they've been carrying for a long time without knowing that was what they were doing. Not all of it. She was not under the impression that a one-land hearing dissolved 2 years of running, but some of it, the piece that had been the heaviest, the ones that said, "What you know is tainted. What you learned there is poison. You cannot use it without using all of it, and all of it is too much." That piece she had put down. In a cold room above the post office, in front of people who had been doubting her since October, she had used what she knew, and it had been enough, and the world had not broken. She looked out the window at the main street. A horse, a wagon, 2 women talking outside the dry goods store, both of them glancing toward the hotel. The dog from outside the livery, still going about its business. Dry Creek, Kansas, the end of December. Cold enough that the street stayed frozen through the afternoon. She was still here. That was the thing. She was still getting used to the fact that she had not run. That the thing she'd been afraid of had come into the room, and she'd sat in her chair and said the words, and it had not destroyed her. She was still in her chair. She was still here, in a hotel dining room, with cold feet and a housekeeper's salary, and a man across the table who had told her twice, once in the dark and once in the daylight, that it changed nothing. Most of its windows were dark. Nellie set her cocoa cup down with a small clunk and looked at Clara with the sudden focus she had when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a decision. "Miss Vance," she said. "Yes," Clara said. Nellie's eyes were very direct and very serious. She said it the way she'd said things before, not as a question, not quite as a statement, but as something she had decided was true and was now declaring, "You're going to stay." The dining room was warm. Outside, the street went on being the street. Silas had gone very still. Clara looked at Nellie, at the 4-year-old girl with her dead mother's memory stitched into a rag doll, and her father's eyes, and the particular fierce certainty of a child who has been burned before, and has decided, despite all of it, to reach again. "Yes," Clara said, "I'm going to stay." Nellie nodded, picked up her cocoa. The matter in her estimation was settled. Silas looked at Clara across the table. She looked back. Outside the window, the Kansas winter pressed its cold, flat self against the glass, and inside the lamp above the table made its small warm circle over the 3 of them. And whatever was happening between the 2 adults in the room was happening in the particular way of things that don't require a name yet present when real, and moving in the direction of something neither of them had expected to be moving toward again. Coffee got cold while they sat there. Neither of them reached to refill it. The days between the hearing and Christmas were quiet in the way that follows a storm, not peaceful, exactly, but settled. The particular stillness of a landscape that has just been through something and is now catching its breath. Briar Hollow caught its breath slowly, the way it did everything. Clara noticed it first in Silas. He was not a different man. After the hearing, she would have been suspicious of that. The kind of transformations too fast and too completely is usually performance. But there was something marginally looser about him. He still got up before 6. He still said very little at breakfast. He still stood at the kitchen window with his coffee, doing that middle distance, thinking she'd learned not to interrupt. But the specific tension that had lived in the set of his jaw and the line of his shoulders since the day Calder's documents arrived that had changed. It wasn't gone because men who have been holding things together by sheer force of habit don't simply stop. But it had moved to a different key, something resolving rather than bracing. Nellie noticed it too in her own way. She had declared the matter settled on the day of the hearing, "You're going to stay," and had apparently filed the whole crisis under completed business. She went back to her stitching practice with renewed focus, which Clara suspected was connected to the fact that she had now seen Clara do something consequential in the world, and this had upgraded Clara's status in Nellie's internal hierarchy in ways that translated practically into a desire to learn more things from her. The darning lessons became daily. The standards Nellie applied to her own work were severe and self-imposed. She would redo a stitch 5 times if it wasn't right, with a determination that would have been impressive in an adult and was somewhat alarming in a 4-year-old. "You don't have to make it perfect," Clara told her one afternoon, watching her unpick a 3rd attempt at a corner stitch. "I know," Nellie said, without looking up, "but I can see where it's wrong. Sometimes done and imperfect is better than not done and perfect," Clara said. Nellie looked up at that. She held the sock in her lap and considered it. Was that true at the hearing? She said. Clara looked at her. What do you mean? You knew about the water before, Nellie said. From when you were in Colorado. But it wasn't you said it wasn't all perfect. What you did there. But it still helped here. Clara was quiet for a moment. Nellie had a way of arriving at things sideways that was unnerving in its accuracy. Yes, Clara said. That's exactly what it was. So the imperfect thing you did before made you able to do the right thing now, Nellie said. Something like that. Nellie looked back at the sock. Okay, she said, and went back to her stitch, this time without unpicking it, and it was not perfect, and she left it. Rook filed the ruling with the county on the 30th of December, 2 days after the hearing. He sent a note to Briar Hollow confirming it. Clara read the note at the kitchen table and then set it on the shelf above the window, the same shelf where she'd found Ruth Mercer's portrait wrapped in cloth, which she'd put back exactly where it was. The note and the portrait shared the shelf without comment, which seemed right. Calder's 30-day appeal period came and went without incident. He did not appeal. He left Dry Creek, quietly, his 2 carriages going back the way they'd come, in the early morning of a January day when the temperature was the kind of cold that discourages drama and encourages simply getting somewhere else. Clara did not see him go. She heard about it from the postal clerk, who heard it from the liveryman who had helped with the horses. By the time the information reached her, it had already been filtered through several opinions, none of which she needed. What mattered was the going, not the commentary on it. January settled in over the plains with its full weight. It was a hard winter, the kind that came in waves, rather than as a steady siege, so that just when the cold seemed to be releasing, another front would arrive from the northwest and remind everyone that the season was not finished with them. The creek that had nearly been the center of everything froze at its edges and ran cold and clear through the middle, exactly as it always had, exactly as it would in spring, belonging entirely to Briar Hollow. Clara looked at that creek every morning from the kitchen window or from the Ispas chaffence when she walked out to shake the ice from the water trough. She had not known the creek well before all of this. She'd known it as part of the farm's geography, the way you know the landscape you live inside. Now she knew it differently. It was the same water, the same bed, the same sound under ice. But she knew what it had cost to keep it, and that changed the quality of looking. The farm itself was coming back. This was not a dramatic thing. Recovery in a farm household is not dramatic. It's incremental and mostly unglamorous, but it was real. The pantry had skin stock. The woodpile was adequate. The broken rail on the porch had been replaced, not by Silas, who kept meaning to get to it, but by Clara, who got to it on a Tuesday afternoon while Nellie napped, using a cedar plank she'd found in the barn and a hammer she'd located after a 10-minute search that confirmed her theory about where Silas put tools when he was done with them. Silas saw it when he came in from the east field and stopped on the porch step and looked at it. You fixed the rail, he said. It was a hazard, she said. He ran his hand along it. You did it right. I know how to hit a nail, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen more of lately, not quite amusement, but the adjacency to it, the place where something almost becomes something else, and then holds back, which she was starting to understand was as close as Silas Mercer got to open humor in daylight. I never said you didn't, he said, and went inside. Sauce escasez. She stood on the porch for a moment in the January cold, and she was aware of something she hadn't thought she'd be aware of again for a long time, which was that she was in the right place. Not because it was easy, not because everything had been resolved into comfort, but because it was the specific place that had required the specific things she had to give, and she had given them, and the place had held her in return. That was the bargain. That was the only bargain worth making. Question of what she and Silas were to each other, the real question, the one Dry Creek had been gossiping about since October from a position of considerable inaccuracy, worked itself out. The way genuine things between reserved people work themselves out, slowly, sideways, in the accumulation of small moments that wouldn't individually mean much, but in aggregate meant everything. It was the coffee at 2 a.m. It was the way he'd put his hand on the table near hers, in the hearing room, not touching, just near. It was the fact that he had told her twice that Colorado changed nothing, once in the dark and once in the daylight, because he understood instinctively that some things need saying in both. It was the night in mid-January when Nellie had a fever and Clara sat up with her, and at midnight Silas appeared in the doorway of Nellie's room and looked at the two of them, Clara in the chair pulled close to the bed, Nellie asleep with Juniper on her pillow, and said, "Go sleep. I'll take the next hours." And Clara said, "I'm not tired," which was not entirely true. And he said, "Clara, go sleep." And the way he said her name, quiet and particular, like it was a word he was accustomed to having in his mouth, was a different kind of saying than she'd heard from him before. She went to sleep. Nellie's fever broke by morning. She was fine within 2 days. She made a full recovery and immediately leveraged the illness for an additional portion of jam at breakfast, which Silas gave her with a resigned expression, and Clara pretended not to see. On a Thursday in late January, Silas found her in the root cellar doing an inventory of what was left from the fall's storage, checking for rot, making notes on what would need restocking before spring. Most of its windows were dark. It was cold work and not interesting work, but someone had to do it before February, and Clara had been putting it off because root cellars were not her preferred environment. He came down the steps and stood in the low space, which was too small for him to stand fully upright, and watched her work for a moment. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She looked up. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working toward something not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of itself. Aware that it was attempting something it hadn't entirely rehearsed. "All right," she said. He said, "I've been thinking about what's right. About what this is. What we are." He stopped. "I'm not good at this." "I know," she said. She set down the jar she was holding. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not trying to." He stopped again. "I don't know how to say it in a way that isn't either too much or not enough." "Then say it in the middle," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Then I'd like you to stay. Not as the housekeeper. As..." He stopped. "I'd like to marry you, Clara. If that's something you'd consider. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm not asking you to do anything about it right now. He paused. "I wanted you to know that's what I want. So you could think about it without being surprised by it." The root cellar was very quiet. Above them, through the floor, she could hear Nellie moving around in the kitchen, talking to Juniper about something. Clara looked at Silas Mercer, this man who had opened a door to a stranger in October and shaken her hand with faint surprise at how firm it was, this man who fixed ragdoll arms with the wrong color thread because the fixing was what mattered, this man who sat with her in the dark without being asked and said difficult things twice. Sure, they landed, and she understood that she had been walking toward something since the day she came. Over the rise and saw the farmhouse light in the dark. She had not known that's what she was doing. She had thought she was just walking toward work. "You're not good at this," she said. For the record, that was not a graceful proposal. "I know," he said. "But I appreciate that you said it now, instead of waiting until it had festered into something strange," she said. "I've been practicing it for 2 weeks," he said. "It was better in my head." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, it was better in your head," or "Yes, I'll marry you," she said. "If you're sure. And I think you're sure." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not the flash and close she'd seen before, but something slower and more permanent. "I'm sure," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up the jar she'd set down. "I need to finish this inventory." He stood there for another second, and she was aware that he was working out whether she was serious about the inventory. She was. And then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to one, low and surprised, and went back up the cellar steps. She finished the inventory. Then she sat on the cellar step for a few minutes herself, in the cold, with the jar in her lap and the smell of earth and winter storage around her, and let herself feel what she was feeling, which was large and somewhat frightening, and also so, underneath all of that, the specific sensation of something that has been long and arduously traveling, finally coming to rest. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. She just sat on the cellar step for a few minutes and breathed, and then went back up into the kitchen. Nellie was at the table, with Juniper in her stitching. She looked up when Clara came in. Clara went to the stove and checked what was on it. Soup from this morning, keeping warm. "What were you and Papa talking about in the cellar?" Nellie said. "Inventory," Clara said. Nellie looked at her. She had the precise expression of a child who knows she's being given a partial truth and is deciding whether to push on it. That took a long time, she said. It was a thorough inventory, Clara said. Nellie looked back at her stitching. Then, without looking up, Juniper says something is different. Juniper is perceptive, Clara said. She usually is, Nellie agreed, and pulled her thread through and said nothing else. And Clara went about making supper, and the kitchen was warm, and the afternoon light outside the window was the thin blue-white of January at 4 o'clock. They told Nellie 2 days later, on a Saturday morning after breakfast, because it seemed wrong to let her find out any other way, and also because Silas said they should tell her now before she extracted it from them through sheer observational persistence, which she would. Silas told her. He said it plainly, that he had asked Clara to marry him, and that Clara had said yes, and that this meant Clara would be staying at Briar Hollow, not as a housekeeper, as family. Nellie listened to all of this sitting in her chair with Juniper in her lap, her face very still in the way it got when she was taking in something large. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told you." Silas looked at her. "What?" "I told you she was going to stay," Nellie said, "when we were at the hotel. After the hearing, I said she was going to stay." "You did say that," Silas agreed. "Juniper said it before me," Nellie added, as though attribution was important. Then she climbed down from her chair, walked around the table to Clara, and without any more ceremony than that, pressed herself against Clara's side and stayed there. Clara put her arm around her. Nellie was thin and warm and smelled like wool, and the particular child smell that Clara had no good words for, but had come to associate entirely with this kitchen, this farm, this life she had accidentally walked toward. Silas watched them from across the table. He had both hands around his coffee cup. He was looking at the two of them with the slow, permanent expression that had replaced the flash and close, the one Clara was starting to recognize as his version of the thing that had no clean word, the thing beyond relief and beyond gratitude, the thing that happens when a man who stopped expecting good things starts receiving them again and hasn't yet fully caught up with his own luck. "Okay," Nellie said finally, pulling back and returning to her chair with the businesslike quality she brought to transitions. When? When what?" Clara said. "When are you getting married?" Silas and Clara looked at each other. "We haven't discussed the details yet," Silas said. "You should discuss them," Nellie said. "Juniper will need to know what to wear." The wedding was set for the second Saturday of February, which was soon, and which Mabel Holt told Clara was very soon, with an emphasis that Clara declined to engage with. The reason it was soon was not dramatic. It was simply that neither Silas nor Clara were people who benefited from extended anticipation, and Nellie had windows were dark, and Nellie began treating the wedding as an organizational project that required immediate practical attention, and it seemed simpler to let it be what it was going to be rather than impose a longer timeline on it. It was not a large wedding. It was not meant to be. The small gathering that assembled in the front room of Briar Hollow on a Saturday morning in February, Rook and his wife, a handful of Silas's neighboring farmers and their families. The pastor who asked no questions about brevity or the plainness of the proceedings was not the whole town, but it was a representative selection of the people who had watched everything happen and were now watching this. Mabel Holt came. Clara had not expected that. She came with her husband, and she sat in the third row, and her face, for once, had been cleared of its management.
Opinions.
Clara suspected Mabel Holt would have opinions until the last breath left her body, but she kept them in her lap on this particular morning, which was more than Clara had required of her. The woman from the dry goods store step came, the one who had put her hand on Clara's arm after the hearing without saying anything. She sat tense at the back. She watched the whole thing with the same unreadable stillness she'd had when Clara first arrived, and when it was over, she caught Clara's eye briefly and gave a small nod. Clara nodded back. Some things between women don't need words, because words would only reduce them. The wedding itself was simple, brief, and imperfect in all the ways that human things are imperfect. Pastor spoke. Silas said the words in his direct way, without embellishment, in exactly the tone of a man who means what he's saying and doesn't need to decorate it. Clara said the words back. Her voice was steady. Not because she wasn't feeling anything, she was feeling a considerable amount, more than she had steady words for, but because she had learned, over the course of a difficult life, that the moments that matter the most require you to show up precisely because they're the moments when everything in you wants to look away. She did not look away. Nellie, standing beside Clara with Juniper under her arm, wearing the good dress with the buttons she could now do herself, said good at the end of the ceremony in a tone of satisfied conclusion, which made Rook's wife put her hand over her mouth, and which made Silas look at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that was losing its battle against itself. Clara looked at Nellie. Nellie looked back at her. "You're my mama now," Nellie said. Very simple. The way a 4-year-old says something is entirely true and entirely momentous, and does not seem to understand why the adults in the room have all gone very still. Clara knelt down to her level. She was aware of the room around them, the people watching, the morning light through the farmhouse windows, Silas standing close, but the only thing she was actually looking at was Nellie's face, those dark, serious eyes, the fine pale hair, the rag doll with the mismatched buttons held against her chest. "Yes," Clara said, "I am." Nellie nodded once, satisfied. Then she held Juniper out. "You can hold her if you want," she said. "She likes you." Clara took the doll. She held it carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of. "Thank you," she said. "You can give her back in a minute," Nellie said. "She'll want to come back in a minute." "I know," Clara said. She stood back up. Silas was right there. He looked at her in the way he had in the hotel dining room, full and direct, and with the permanent expression, not the flash and close, and she looked back at him. And around them the room had the warm, slightly loud quality. People who have witnessed something real and are now talking, because people do, because that's what people are. The day went the way good days go. When they don't demand too much of you, it simply happened. Unhurried, warm enough inside against the February cold outside, with food and conversation, and Nellie conducting Juniper on a tour of the house for the benefit of the assembled guests, explaining each room with the authority of someone who has considered herself the household's primary authority for some time, and is graciously sharing that authority on a one-time basis. Later in the afternoon, when most people had gone, and the house had settled back into its own shape, Clara sat on the repaired porch rail in her wedding dress and good coat, looking out at the east pasture. The creek was still frozen at the edges. The cedar fence posts on the eastern boundary, the ones Silas had replaced in November, driving them in with the same focused economy he brought to all necessary work, stood straight against the flat gray sky. She had arrived here with one carpet bag and a past she didn't know how to stop carrying. She had not arrived planning to stay. She had not arrived planning anything beyond the next several months, the next several dollars, the next place that might let her exist, without requiring her to explain herself. What she had found instead was this: a man with a broken-armed doll and no ability to put things back where they belonged, a child who conducted loyalty tests through the medium of a rag doll, a creek that needed protecting, a past that turned out to be useful rather than only damaging. She had found, without looking for it, the exact size and shape of a life that fit her imperfect, cold in the mornings, prone to broken fence rails and root cellars, and the particular stubbornness of a 4-year-old who had Silas's jaw and her mother's determination and opinions that appeared to predate her ability to properly explain them. The door opened behind her and Silas came out, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He gave her one and leaned against the post beside her. They stood without talking for a while. The east pasture was very flat and very cold, and the creek ran dark between its frozen edges. "Brooke says the corrected survey will be in the county register by the end of the month," Silas said. "Permanently." "Good," Clara said. "Calder's company has been active in 2 other counties," he said. "Rook thinks his case may be looked at again, given the method." "Rook would know," she said. "He says you ought to think about whether you want to consult on cases like that," Silas said. "Survey-related disputes. He says you know more about it than he does, and he's not the kind of man who says that unless he means it." Clara looked at her coffee cup. She had not thought about it. She turned it over now carefully, the way she turned things over when they mattered. Not the housekeeper's salary. Something different. Something that used the specific thing she had spent 2 years trying to bury. "Think about it," she said. "That's all I said to him," Silas said. She looked at him. "You already talked to him about it. Briefly, without asking me. I said you'd think about it," he said. "I didn't commit you to anything. I thought you'd want to know it was possible." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the east pasture, with the middle-distance expression, which she had learned was not evasion but actual thought. She had a great deal. she could say about the business of discussing her future without her present, and she set all of it aside for a different reason than she'd have set it aside 3 months ago. Not because she was afraid of his response, but because she understood his intention, and his intention was not management but inclusion. And those were genuinely different things. Fine, she said. Fine, you'll think about it. Or fine, I talked to Rook. Both, she said. Neither. I'll think about it. He nodded, drank his coffee. She drank hers. After a while, he said, she's been walking Juniper around the house, explaining the day to her. I heard, Clara said. She included a summary of the legal dispute. She had the parcel numbers wrong, he said. She's 4, Clara said. Still, he said. He paused. She has them approximately right. That's concerning. Clara felt the thing happen to her face that she'd stopped trying to manage. Silas saw it, and the corners of his mouth did what they did the adjacency, the almost, and for a moment on the February porch of Briar Hollow farm, they were both, briefly, simply amused by their daughter, who was inside the house giving a rag doll a legal briefing. The word daughter sat in Clara's mind for a moment. She had not let herself use it yet, even internally. She tried it now, quietly, on the inside, like testing weight on a new board. It held. The afternoon light was going. January was past. The worst of the winter was past. The creek was theirs. The survey was on record. Colorado was a chapter that had closed into something she could carry differently now, not without weight, but without shame, which was a distinction she had not known, until recently, was possible. What happened to her in Denver had not been her failing. She had known that, abstractly, for 2 years. She knew it differently now in the specific bodily way you know something when the world has actually confirmed it, instead of just when you've told yourself it's true. The knowledge she'd gained in that land office, that she'd spent 2 years trying not to use, because it came from a painful place that knowledge had saved a farm, saved a family's water, saved the eastern pasture where the creek still ran cold and clear and entirely theirs. Harlan Fitch had used her. She had not known. She had learned from what happened, and the learning was not tainted by the source. That was the thing she wanted to know, and she knew it now. The door opened again and Nellie appeared still in her good dress, juniper in hand, pink-cheeked from being inside near the stove too long. Cold out here, she observed. Yes, Silas said. Then why are you out here? Sometimes people stand outside in the cold on purpose, Clara said. Nellie looked at her with the expression that meant she was accepting an answer she found insufficient. She came to stand beside Clara, leaning against her leg, and looked out at the pasture the way the two of them were looking at it. The creek's still frozen, Nellie said. Just at the edges, Clara said. It'll melt in spring, Nellie said. This was not a question. Yes, Clara said. And then we'll still have it, Nellie said. The water, it'll still be ours. Yes, Clara said. It will. Nellie considered this with her customary gravity. Then she shifted Juniper to her other arm and leaned more firmly against Clara's leg and looked out at the eastern pasture in the February cold with the specific satisfaction of someone who has verified an important fact and found it intact. The three of them stood on the porch of Briar Hollow Farm. The light was going soft and gray over the flat land. The cedar fence posts on the eastern boundary stood straight and solid. The creek ran between its frozen edges, dark and quiet and relentlessly itself. Clara held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the land she was now, part of the land she had read the documents to save, the land she had walked toward on an October evening with one bag and no expectations, and a past she hadn't yet figured out how to carry. She thought about that woman on the rise, tired, cold, practical, not yet knowing what was below, and felt a complicated tenderness toward her that was not quite pity and not quite pride, but something in the territory between them. That woman had kept walking. That was all. That was the whole thing. She had kept walking toward the light in the window when she had every reason not to, when she had been told by experience and by failure and by a man named Fitch and by the land office and by 2 years of running that the light was probably not for her. She had kept walking anyway, because she was cold and she needed work, and because some part of her that was more stubborn than sensible had not yet finished believing in the next place. The next place had been this one. Not perfect, not without cost or complication, or the daily ordinary friction of a farmhouse in Kansas in winter, of a man who put things back in the wrong place and struggled to say things directly the first time, of a 4-year-old who tested everything before she trusted it and was right to. Not perfect, but real and specific and hers. Clara felt Silas's hand find hers in the February cold. Neither of them were looking at each other, both of them looking at the land, and his hand found hers the way familiar things find each other in the dark, without needing to look. She turned her palm up. He held it. Nellie, leaning against her other side, said, "Juniper wants to know if there will be pie at supper." "There will be pie," Clara said. "What kind?" "Apple." Nellie relayed this to Juniper with the seriousness it deserved. Then she says that's acceptable. "Tell her I'm relieved," Clara said. Silas's hand tightened briefly on hers. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She knew what was in it, the same thing she was holding, the same weight, the same relief that is not really relief, because relief implies it was ever in question, and this, whatever this was, whatever it was still in the process of becoming, had stopped being in question somewhere between the root cellar and the prepared porch rail and 2 cups of coffee at 2 in the morning and a hearing room above the post office and a hotel dining room where a 4-year-old declared things settled. It had stopped being in question before either of them said the words. The words were just the ceremony. The real thing had been building itself out of smaller materials, out of extra place settings, and darning lessons, and cold coffee, and fence wire, and a certified county survey, and the particular look of a man who had been asked not to push and had respected it. Out of imperfect things, out of everything that hadn't worked right and had been done anyway. The farmhouse lamp came on in the window behind them. Nellie had gone back inside without either of them noticing, the door swinging shut quietly behind her, and its light fell out across the porch boards and touched the cold February air with its small, warm reach. Clara had seen that light from the rise on the night she arrived. She had walked toward it then not knowing what it was. She knew now. It was the same light it had always been. She was just finally in the right place to understand what she'd been walking toward.